So we've got two fantastic speakers. So Clive Blacker from Map of Ag and Hugh Martineau also from Map of Ag. Because we can't run the video that we were hoping to, I just want to talk for just a couple of minutes about the Kellogg's Origins project. I'm looking at Alistair Leake, who's also in the front row here, who's also from Game and Wildlife Conservation Trust. Alistair's also heavily involved in the project. So it's all funded by Kellogg's. It's a global project. There are over 400,000 farmers across the world involved in the project. And it's all about use of environmental practice and putting things actually into practice with sustainability sort of centre stage. In the UK, the project's been running about 8 years, since 2013. We've got 18 farmers involved in the UK, mainly around the Haygates Mill area in sort of Northamptonshire. It's a different project to a lot of the sort of more corporate type sustainability projects in that there is no premium play. I've just spotted one of my Kellogg's farmers. There is no premium paid to the farmers, but it's all about knowledge. It's all about innovative ideas, learning, and then spreading that information. So over the years, we've done a big cover crop trial with NIAB. We think that was probably one of the biggest, or the biggest field trial in the UK. We've also got an insect trial running. If anybody's here tomorrow, Phil Jarvis will be here speaking about that. We took the group of Kellogg's farmers to Denmark to do some nitrogen studies. And of course, the Map of Ag work, which is ongoing. We've also looked at drones, been to Harper, done all sorts of things. I hope the farmers that are here would agree I hope they get a lot from it. Okay, I'm not Duncan, so I'm not going to talk anymore. And I'm going to hand over to Clive Blacker, who is, I'm checking now, head of arable and produce at the Map of Ag, who's going to talk to us today about nitrogen utilisation. Thanks, Clive.
Excellent. So thanks very much, Jill. You'll be really pleased to know that instead of the 20-minute slot that they'd allocated me, with Duncan not being here, you've got me now for an hour. So we've been given very little notice, unfortunately, and I feel sorry for poor old Duncan, who was so excited to be let out after lockdown, to be tied at home. Fortunately, he's a partner in a brewery, so I think he's making up for it in other ways. So the plan, if everything's working, is what I'm going to do is quickly introduce what we've been doing with the Kellogg's Origins project this year. I'm going to talk a little bit about my background with nitrogen use efficiency on farm and the journey I've been going on with nitrogen use efficiency, and it's something that I'm really passionate about. So to give you a bit of background to me and where I come in, I work with my brother on the family farm at home. My brother runs the farm, and I complicate the hell out of his life by imposing trials and different philosophies on him. And we've been looking at nitrogen use efficiency on our own farm at home since about 2016 when we first started looking at it. Just as a quick show of hands, how many of you know or could tell me now on a field-by-field basis what your nitrogen use efficiency is on each field? Is nobody sticking their hand up?
Henry, come on.
Come on, Henry, you've done it. So, nitrogen use efficiency, it strikes me, from a climate change perspective, Hugh's going to talk a lot more about this than I am, but, as farmers, it's our single biggest input, and it's our single biggest liability towards climate change. And we've got to use it better, and we've spent millions as a country over years doing nitrogen research. And when we were involved in an auto-N project on the farm at home, I was really surprised when we took lots of deep N cores across the one field. It's only a 6-hectare field, 15 acres, and we had over 100 kilos of soil variability in nitrogen supply. And that really got me thinking about, well, how are we using our nitrogen? And I'm somebody who sits here who has been a precision farming anorak for the last 20-odd years, very much instrumental behind working with farmers with the N sensor and variable rate nitrogen technology. But it really struck me that I really didn't know what my own nitrogen use efficiency was either. So this is what drove me in 2016 to really start challenging my thinking and thinking about my most expensive asset and how it's applied. So what we've been doing is developing tools around different nitrogen measurement systems so we can understand what's going on in the crop, and then looking at how we can manipulate nitrogen rates better to really improve our use efficiency. And then the plan will be, I'll give you some take-home thoughts when we finish. So, obviously when we're thinking about fertiliser, we're being driven to think about our optimum rate. And rarely do we take in cost into it as a significant part of it. We're inbred to at universities and everywhere we study nitrogen that the more we put on, the more we're going to get back, and that generally, we need to be putting plenty on to get the return. And while we're trying to target the optimum rates for nitrogen, and we're trying to get the best out of it, it struck me that there isn't as much science goes on with it as you think. And we think about, well, when we apply things, it's all based on our own eye, our own judgment, and probably on a calendar more than it is about the crop. So with some of the technologies we've been working with, we've been looking at how we can improve that. And if you think about nitrogen use efficiency in the UK perspective, and bear in mind we are one of the world's most efficient producers, according to Edward Downing from Frontier, the average UK farm is only about 60% use efficient. So 40% of what we're applying in nitrogen is disappearing somewhere. And that's quite staggering. It struck me that I wanted to try and do something about that. And if we put that into perspective, if we look at John Nix, for example, and here he's only quoting about using 190 kilos of nitrogen, and for that 190 kilos of nitrogen in this edition I've got at the time, that's an investment we're making as farmers of about £143 a hectare. If we then consider that only 60% of that is use efficient, and it appears that my clicker's not working. Oh, it is. No, it's me being an idiot. I'm not clicking it on my own iPad. So 64% use efficiency, which is where we are in the UK, that's the equivalent return for the investment of £143 of only £91. So there's a £51 loss somewhere in the system where we're making that investment that we're not getting back. And if I took any of you to the horse races and asked you to put money on a horse with those sort of odds, I don't think many of you would take me up on that. So really trying to improve that, then it struck me we've got to do something different. I've worked with Yara for a lot of years, and I've been a big believer in some of the technologies that Yara have produced and the capabilities of it. And from the perspective of one of the tools in particular, the N tester, it's a leaf chlorophyll meter. It's a device that we can use to measure the amount of nitrogen in the plant leaf, and it gives us an assistance to be able to make a decision on whether we put more or less nitrogen on and account for the nitrogen that's actually with the plant. The fundamental thinking behind it is actually we're using the plant as a sensor, and we're just reading what the plant's telling us. And I've always believed in that philosophy from Yara. It's often, it's something that I really do think is really, really sensible. So by using this device, typically in the past, you would have used it to make a decision to top up your second and third application. But we've turned that on its head as well. And while it's still in use for that, and Yara have recommendations for that, what we've been doing is trying to put a little bit more science behind it as well. We've been going out with the N tester. For those of you that haven't seen it, it's a handheld leaf reader. You click 30 leaves and it gives you a very instant reading for how much nitrogen uptake is in the crop canopy. And that's the key bit. It's measuring how much the crop has already got in it. I've been encouraging the growers that we've been working with Origins to go out to the same point in the field every three to 4 days, although it can get a lot longer than that when we get busy. To measure the actual concentration in leaf nitrogen. And rather than the philosophy that some of you may recall from about 10 or 15 years ago, where we were sort of encouraged to stress our crops to wait till crops were going yellow before we put the nitrogen on, I've always been concerned about that approach, because the last thing I want to do, there's enough things in our crops that are stressing them with the way the weather's been more recently. And any stress that we put on a crop is going to damage its yield potential. So the ability to target the yield potential and measure that means we don't want to stress the crop. You might want to strangle the dog, though. I was joking. So looking at the leaf and not stressing the plant has been critical. And I go back to my previous comments about how we think about the timing of nitrogen application. We put it on when we think the plant needs it and pay very little science to when it actually needs it. So the methodology we're using is literally just measuring what's in the crop. So these graphs, you'll see a few of these. So what you can see here is a combination of different information. The yellow line at the bottom is my rainfall that I take on a weekly basis. The blue lines that you can see are the total amounts of nitrogen and when I've applied them. And the red line that you can see going up and down is the leaf concentrations of nitrogen. And the graph you can see on there at the moment is just me monitoring farm practice. So this was the first year I trialled this. I wanted to see what we were doing in fields where we weren't manipulating nitrogen, and then comparing that to the different approach that I was trying to quantify and understand. And you can see there's some very low readings. We get down to sort of less than 500 on the end tester readings. And one thing I have learned this year is that every year is totally different. If we compare that approach then in the same season to a different field where, I'm just checking we're getting the right slides, where I've had a managed approach, you can see I've set a threshold. So there's a red line goes vertically across the graphs. And what we've been trying to do is make sure that the nitrogen doesn't get below that level. And if it's getting below that level, then the crop's into stress. And certainly for the last 2 seasons, we've seen stress conditions through lack of moisture, which has prevented plants uptaking nitrogen up. That's really limited uptake. So it's been quite an interesting learning curve these last couple of years. The concept being that when the plant is getting to a deficiency stage, we don't stress it, we apply the nitrogen and put the next dressing on. And you can see from the previous slide, we'd applied 219 kilos of N. We're now looking at a total of 188 kilos of N. And what that's allowing me to do is it's allowing me to target the nitrogen when the plant actually needs it. So when the plant needs it, it's going to utilize it better, so I get better use efficiency. And it's quite a simple philosophy. Now normally what we would see is in a season where we have moisture and we have decent temperatures, that I would be seeing nitrogen uptake occurring in sort of 3 to 6 days. You can see very quickly I've made an application of nitrogen to, in this case, a stress crop. This was last year in the middle of April when we'd had all that horrible dry period that was causing us problems. You can see I've made an application of nitrogen within 3 to 6 days. I can see even after a very small amount of moisture that I'm getting nitrogen uptake occurring in the plants and it's building the levels back up. I can't put nitrogen into a crop when it can't take it up if there's no moisture. With this approach, I was fairly confident going into this season when we started working with other growers that I'd really understood what would be happening within our crops, but how little did I know. And what we found this season is certainly by introducing more sensors, so we've put more sensors in the system, so we've been monitoring soil moisture and soil temperature so that we could actually see what's going on. I was very curious to know where my soil moisture levels were, so I was very reassured in April this year when I could see the levels of soil moisture coming down even at depth, so I could see rooting was occurring even when we saw there was very limited plant growth on the surface. But the soil temperature was a real eye-opener. And because we had all those frosts in those dry periods, it really caused some other problems in terms of stress. And what actually turned out to be happening this year is that nitrogen uptake has been really restricted because the biological activity we rely on to convert the fertilizer we apply into a form that plants can utilize has been limited. And nitrogen uptake certainly this season has been delayed by up to 22 days. And I've never known a season where we're in a position where you're putting nitrogen on and it's then exposed to the environmental and the environmental conditions in ways that potentially could lead to more losses. And in some cases, we've been putting large doses of nitrogen on in some areas, at best with 64% use efficiency. But when it's sat there in the environment for another additional 20-odd days, then there's a greater potential for loss and erosion of our profitability from that perspective. And what's been fascinating this year is certainly that learning of the soil temperature and how that influences things. And one or two of the growers we've been working with this year have been trying biological products. Any of you that are trying to work with the biology and work with biological products, this year, certainly in those cold period, it's a real eye-opener to why they're not working. And it's certainly, if we're going to use those as new methodologies and new approaches, it's one of my take-home messages is to really look at the soil temperature, because there are conditions that you can't do things in and make things work when the soil doesn't let them. What did we find then with our use efficiency trials in the first season? So this is the example of what we actually achieved. I was staggered that by putting less nitrogen on in more applications, that I actually achieved a yield advantage. And I apologise, these slides are quite noisy. So if you look at the grey bars, for example, where we've had a managed approach with nitrogen, we've applied 188 kilos of nitrogen. The farm practice was typically somewhere between 210 and 220 kilos of N. So that's a saving in total for us of about 30 kilos of nitrogen. When I compare that then to farm yield, what we actually also saw was a 7% increase in crop yield, which gave us an extra half a tonne, just over half a tonne a hectare yield benefit. So for the field that we were doing the experimentation in, not only did I improve my farm practice from 64% use efficiency up to 83, I actually got an extra margin across the whole field of over 1,400 quid. So the investment in the technology is very, very quickly paid for without the environmental losses that I'm sure in the future we're going to be rewarded on as time goes on. So it's been a real eye-opener and a real journey. This last season, last year's results were very interesting. We achieved at some points over 130% use efficiency. And you may question, how on earth can you get 130% use efficiency? And that's because we're actually mining nitrogen out of the soil. We've used everything we'd applied from the bag and taken another 30 or 40 kilos of nitrogen out of the soil. And that's certainly something we're quantifying this year with the trial work we're doing, is by introducing the soil moisture probes. We've introduced pre-season deep nitrogen analysis and post-season deep nitrogen analysis. We're taking grain protein analysis, so we get a full understanding of the full nitrogen balance within the plant. My take-home messages for you are obviously, if you're not already looking at your nitrogen use efficiency, I seriously stress you'd look at it. You can't improve anything if you don't know where you're starting from. And one of the things we've done for the Kellogg's group is build a digital platform that allows them to benchmark their users against each other. And you can see on your farm, on a field-by-field basis, your nitrogen use efficiency to get the best out of that. And that's something that Hugh will show you a little bit more about in a moment. Obviously, there's great technology out there. Use the technology to your advantage to make informed decisions on nitrogen use efficiency. Some of the users, there's one or two in the audience that have been trialling that this year, are probably questioning my parentage because we've really stressed their decisions. And the first time you do this, it is a real sharp learning curve. The crops might not look as flash and as bold and as full as we're used to with nitrogen, and particularly at the rates the technology might suggest. We haven't used the technology advice for how to apply nitrogen. We've used a sort of different program we've developed in the background, but use the technology to really drive the timing more than anything else. Really do use that technology. There's some great aids out there that let you monitor the plant in a lot more detail, and let the plant be the sensor. The plant is the best thing. It's in the environment that we're working with. We have variability in the environment with our soils, within the growing conditions, and within the season. So it's really important that you listen to the poor things that are in there that are dealing with that. And the other big take home I had this year is look at your soil temperatures. Soil biology is absolutely key to everything we do in farming. It's instrumental to how we convert the nitrogen and get it into the plant. And if that's not going to work because soil temperatures are cold, then we need to understand that a little bit better. And I shall leave it there and hand over to you.
Thank you very much, Clive. Oh. Yeah, thank you. Have we got any burning questions now that you would like to ask Clive before we move on to Hugh's presentation? Okay, can I ask? Yeah. How difficult, well, it's perhaps partly looking at Henry as well. Come on, get joined in. How difficult it is to hold your nerve when you feel like you should be putting on the usual amount of nitrogen. Has that been particularly difficult? And I'll perhaps look at Henry, who's one. Sorry to put you on the spot, Henry, but Henry is one of the Kellogg's Origins farmers who's been involved in this.
We've only got a small building, so not got a large area, which helps. I've not been looking at it too much.
I mean, the first time you do this, it's a real eye-opener and it's a real challenge. And as I've been upfront with all the growers that we work with, that this is a different approach and it will stress you. And you will question my parentage because it is different to what we're taught and what we understand. And in some cases this year we've got growers, and Henry, you're maybe among them, that's only put on 120, 130 kilos of nitrogen. It's totally alien to what we're taught and the research that we're driven by. But if we're getting that full 130 kilos of N that we're applying from the bag into the plant, we're probably still at the same utilisation levels that you are if you're putting 220 kilos of N on and getting poor utilisation. So we're not a million miles away.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so if no more, I'll hand over to you.
Thanks. I'm going to stand because I'm not as relaxed as Clive. I'm going to test a principle with you today that nitrogen use efficiency is the route to a sustainable agricultural system. And we talk about nitrogen in the system in agriculture more generally, not just in the wheat crop, as Clive's been talking about, but perhaps in the wider context, especially around livestock systems. And we look at nitrogen in various different forms and how it comes onto the farm. So whether it's protein coming onto the farmers as animal feed, as well as nitrogen in the form of fertilizer coming on in the bagged form. And then how do we look at the use of other organic sources of fertilizer on the farm as well. So I kind of want us to think about it in the round rather than just specifically in the context of the wheat production. I'm also just going to run you through one or two of the results in the context of greenhouse gas emissions impacts, looking not only at the farm emissions in terms of nitrous oxide emissions from farm, but also the upstream emissions from the production of inorganic fertilizers as well that's brought onto farm. So actually, I should probably give a quick introduction to myself first. So I'm Hugh Martineau. I'm Head of Sustainability at Map of Ag. I've now been with Map of Ag for a year. I spent the previous 15 years with a company called Ricardo Energy and Environment, where I was looked after an agriculture team in a larger environmental consultancy. And I've worked on sustainable agriculture and specifically around greenhouse gas emissions for well over a decade now. And it's really interesting just to see the focus on this particular area in the last couple of years. It felt like we're kind of pushing water uphill for the best part of 10 years, but just to see the number of people here who are talking about greenhouse gas emissions, are talking about sustainable agriculture here today is really refreshing, and it's meant that I've been incredibly busy over the last year or so. The reason I transitioned into Map of Ag was really to see how we make better use of data to be able to inform our decisions. We see we talk a lot about data in agriculture, but actually what we find is that we need really good high-resolution data at a farm scale, the kind of stuff that Clive was talking about, in order to be able to understand the baseline and then inform our decision-making in the future. The other thing I'd sort of comment on as a general observation is that we talk a lot about carbon, and we talk a lot about carbon dioxide in the farming system, but really what I think we should be thinking about more is nitrogen. Actually, nitrous oxide is, as Clive pointed out, the biggest greenhouse gas emissions from cereal production. Methane, in terms of the emissions from livestock production, is the largest share as well. But if we can adjust our nitrogen and improve our nitrogen utilization, then I believe that other things will effectively fall into place. And if we build soil organic matter, not necessarily to claim soil organic carbon credits within carbon markets, but we do it for the reasons of agronomic benefit, then we stand a much better chance of meeting the demands of a sustainable agricultural system in the future. I haven't even moved on a slide yet. Okay. So why do we focus on nitrogen use efficiency? So the economic impact is first and foremost. Nitrogen is our biggest cost in arable production systems. In the wheat crop, it represents 40 to 45% of the variable cost. That's the single biggest cost we've got. In terms of societal cost, There's an interesting bit of work done by DEFRA on the demonstration test catchments, which estimated the externalities, the costs of the external effect of nitrogen in lowland agricultural systems as being between £1 and £200 per hectare, which is huge. In terms of the environmental impacts, which links to those externalities that we talked about, we've got the greenhouse gas emissions impact, the climate change impact, air quality, the ammonia impact on air quality, water quality from nitrate, and biodiversity impacts, the sort of indirect impacts on biodiversity either in the water or as deposition of ammonia, which disrupts sensitive habitats. Just to touch on that in a bit more detail, I'll go into each of those in a bit more detail in a moment, but here's an overly simplistic representation of nitrogen in the system. So we see nitrogen coming into the system as feed and fertilizer, as external inputs of nitrogen into the system. Now, Clive talked a bit about arable systems, where we've got potentially 60-65% nitrogen use efficiency. In livestock systems, it's significantly lower than that. If you factor in the nitrogen and protein which is being brought onto the farm, how we're utilizing the organic nitrogen which is available in the system, we're probably talking a best case scenario between 30 and 40% within livestock systems. So there's some way to go and some improvements that can be made in that area as well. And then obviously there's the interactions on the farm in terms of how we make use of the manures and slurries, where those losses occur from there as well in terms of the ammonia emissions, the nitrous oxide emissions, and the nitrates that are leached out of soils as well. And then thinking about the balance, so what are we bringing onto the farm? How efficiently are we using it within that farm system? And then what's ultimately sold off the farm? And I believe every farm should have a really good understanding of what's being brought on versus actually what's leaving the system, even as a really basic nitrogen mass balance. So firstly, just talking a bit briefly about the impacts of nitrogen in the system. So we've talked a bit about nitrous oxide, or I've mentioned it. Nitrous oxide represents 31-32% of emissions within our national atmospheric emissions inventory, the way that we measure our greenhouse gas emissions at a national scale. What that doesn't account for is the embedded emissions, the emissions associated with the production of fertilizer which is brought into the system, and that falls into different categories within inventory, and much of it is actually an international sort of offshore emission. But we do need to think about that when we're thinking about things like product carbon footprint. In terms of the wheat production system, which I'm going to go into the results in a second, we've got a representation of between 75 and 80% of the emissions arising from nitrous oxide. So it's really, really important. If we're going to drive down the emissions intensity of our production within arable systems and specifically the wheat system, which I'll come on to, we need to be thinking about how we reduce that nitrous oxide emission. Nitrous oxide is, according to the IPCC's most recent guidance, is 265 times more potent than CO2. So every action we take to reduce nitrous oxide has a really big impact on the global warming potential. Nitrates, now this is one that we've been trying to tackle for many years. The impact on water quality, we're continuing to see failures around Water Framework Directive, and it's an area that we've really struggled to address, I think. There's a number of reasons why it's important. There's obviously the ecological impact within the watercourse, but also there's the impact on treatment of water, so our drinking water supply. And that externality, that external cost I was talking about earlier, relates a lot to the treatment of water. And we end up with poorly targeted legislative interventions, which I think things like NVZ, we can do much better than what NVZ actually do as a sort of legislative intervention in order to address some of the nitrates problems. If we look at it more holistically, if we try and understand what the nitrogen use efficiency, for example, is, then we've got a far better chance of actually beating the legislation effectively. We can avoid sort of overly burdensome administration around some of that legislation. And I farm in Wales, despite my accent, and we have just announced a whole Wales NVZ And it's a blunt instrument, effectively. It's not getting to the root cause of the problem. If we actually understand that sort of mass balance approach, where we actually know what's being brought onto the farm versus what's leaving the farm, we stand a much better chance of actually reducing the overall impact of nitrogen on the various different environmental areas where it affects. And finally, just to talk about ammonia emissions. Ammonia emissions from the use of urea fertilizers, the use of organic manures is a significant contributor to the ammonia emission that we have. Agriculture is 87% of the UK total ammonia emissions, and that creates problems for air quality. So it creates secondary particulate matter as it binds with other nitrous oxide-based compounds in the atmosphere, which leads to human health impacts, but it also leads to species impacts on species diversity as it's deposited within sensitive habitats as well. So there's biodiversity and air quality benefits if we are able to reduce that overall burden. Now, we have legislation around that called the National Emission Ceiling Directive. We scraped through by the skin of our teeth on the 2020 target. The 2030 target for that is exceedingly challenging, and there is already legislation which is lined up to come in through the Clean Air Strategy, and we will be seeing that coming through. So the more we can do as an industry to reduce that overall burden, the better off we'll be longer term. So moving on to the Kellogg's results. So the year one was all about setting the baseline. We weren't necessarily putting the testers that Clive talked about in the hands of growers at that stage, but we wanted to determine what the sort of baseline situation was. What we've done with that information is just to do some modelling around the greenhouse gas emissions impacts. We're looking at nitrous oxide from emissions and from application, and also the upstream emissions. For the simplicity of the presentation of this, we've taken an approach where we've treated all nitrogen as similar, so it's effectively an ammonium nitrate product, purely to illustrate the impact of the upstream emissions on a comparative level. We're very aware that there are very different emissions factors that can be applied to different nitrogen products, but for the sake of simplicity and the sake of presentation, it's quite interesting just to look at it all as a comparative level of upstream emission. And what we can safely say is there's a huge amount of variability. Each of the bars on this chart represent a field within the farms. So the 6 farms that we looked at, each farm put forward a different number of fields. So each bar represents a different field on the farm. And so we see, and what Clive's results showed was actually a significant variability between each of the fields, and a range of between 45 and 120% nitrogen use efficiency, which on the one hand shows huge potential. On the other hand, I have personal concerns over that, where you get above 90, 100%, where you're actually mining nutrients in the soil, and understanding actually what are we doing to the soil in order to create that environment where we're pulling that much nitrogen out. And actually, in terms of the depletion of organic matter in order to achieve that is the concern. It's just a slightly different way of representing it. Along the bottom of the chart there, we've got input nitrogen in terms of kilograms of nitrogen per hectare, and up the side we've got output. So in these fields we've got sort of suboptimal, we've got the same level of about 220 kilograms of nitrogen per hectare being applied here, and we've got slightly more variable rates within these fields here. So basically, down here we're looking poorer, up here we're looking above 100%. Now, what does that mean in terms of the greenhouse gas emissions intensity? So this shows the range, and the light blue bar is the emissions from application, and the dark blue bar is the emissions from upstream. So it shows the impact of the upstream emissions from the purchase of nitrogen fertilizer, basically. And what we saw is that the emissions intensity in terms of the yield is a range between 250 kilograms of CO2 equivalent per ton up to 550. And that's a huge variation in terms of the emissions impact for each of these farms. And it gives you an illustration of what the potential is if we are actually able to get down towards the bottom end of that. We also represent that in terms of emissions intensity from protein, so 1.8 kilograms to 4.1. It's just another way of looking at very similar data. So just the last couple of slides looking at future opportunities. And this is sort of more a bit of conceptual thinking that we've been doing at the moment. So how do we translate this into actually understanding of nitrogen use efficiency within the field boundary? And how does that translate into profitability at a farm scale? So understanding how much nitrogen needs to go on to actually generate that yield of crop and whether it is actually of suboptimal economic performance. So by using better technology within the field, we can understand which areas are yielding enough to represent a gross margin, a profit effectively, and which areas aren't actually generating much profit and may be better placed, put into agri-environment schemes for the future. So this is a really interesting way of trying to get in-field options. No longer do we necessarily have to put the environmental buffers around the boundaries of fields. With this type of information, we can actually put things into fields with better understanding, better knowledge, and better data on what actually the in-field variability looks like. And then finally, how do we get this to work, I suppose, is how do we incentivize this activity? I don't think anything I've said is particularly revolutionary. We all know nitrogen is expensive. We all know it has an environmental impact, but it continues to have that impact. So how do we actually get funding into the system in order to put technology into farmers' hands in order to create a system that allows us to be more efficient with the use of nitrogen? I have a bit of an idea around whether we can actually have a nitrogen market as opposed to a carbon market. If you have a nitrogen market, you can actually generate emissions reductions within the year that you're benefiting from that application. So if you can put funding in place, either through private or public money, to actually get the technology into farmers' hands to allow them to say, well, actually, I've been able to reduce my nitrogen applications by 30, 40 kilograms of nitrogen per hectare, and that's been achieved through better targeting, better use of technology, then that's something that's worth rewarding within the market, either through public funding or through private funding. And it's not this long-term return. I mean, the carbon stock changes and carbon sequestrations is incredibly important, but it's also incredibly uncertain. This stuff, we can actually generate a return within the year that we're doing, making the changes. And I think that's really important. So I'll stop there. I'll hand you back to Jill, and there may be some questions, hopefully.
Yep. Thank you, Hugh. Okay, have we got any questions from anybody, please? Don't be shy.
William.
A question for Clive. If the current system of doing less tillage, you get very little mineralisation of nitrogen in the spring, so we might take a short long nitrogen coming into zero. How would that work in yours?
Well, one of the challenges we've got, for those of you that didn't hear the question, William's looking at, because he's used on reduced tillage, he doesn't feel as though he gets a soil mineralisation early on because of the not moving the soil. He front loads his nitrogen. You know, one of the challenges that we've got with all our systems is, you know, when we start looking at and understanding mineralisation, we have absolutely no bloody idea, to be quite honest. You know, when we do deep end soil cores, a lot of that data on availability of nitrogen is based on models of what might become available at some point in the season, within a growing season. And we're never sure how much each soil is going to release or when that will become available. And that's one of the challenges we've had, particularly after cover crops, is knowing what's going on in that biological system that we really don't understand. And, you know, my advice is get the nitrogen on, get it up and away, and just make sure you're not over-applying nitrogen to a point that you'll never get it back. You know, when we put a lot of nitrogen on our crop very early, you know, we might only have 15, 20 kilos of nitrogen within a crop when you're putting it on at growth stage 30 or before. You know, it doesn't need a lot of nitrogen then. It can't utilise a lot of nitrogen then. It needs sufficient to keep it going. But what we don't want to do is make it deficient. But equally, what we don't want to do is put our nitrogen in a position where it's going to bugger off somewhere else and we not get the benefit out of it. So it's just trying to fine-tune that system. And, you know, the other challenge that we have is not only don't we understand the soil, If we had a decent weather forecasting system and yield potential system that we knew what was going to happen, then you know, it would be a lot easier. But obviously, your skill as a farmer is the talent that makes you what you are. Well, that's one of the benefits of the plant monitoring on a regular basis, is you can actually see what's happening. So I haven't looked at different technologies and different techniques. A lot of the growers in the system this year have been using liquid. We use solid at home. To be honest, to date, I can't find any definable differences within uptake between the two different systems, if I'm honest. It'd have been quite interesting to see anything that had urea this year with an inhibitor on it as well, to see what that was doing. But I really couldn't answer that.
Thank you, Clive. Any more questions? Yeah, one at the back, please. Shout if you can, please. Sorry.
Sorry if I missed this. Is it everything you're talking about, is it all synthetic nitrogen, or is there any organic?
No, we're accounting for organics in the system as well. Yeah.
So it's like a mix.
Yeah.
Okay, another question here.
Yeah, hi. I just wondered if you could give us an idea about the greenhouse gas emissions that would be from urea or ammonium nitrate or other nitrogen fertilizers. How do they vary in terms of the most efficient plants, say, for each type?
So in terms of the application, they do vary in terms of, so the difference is you tend to get lower nitrous oxide emissions from a urea product than you will from an ammonium nitrate product, but you get higher ammonia emissions from urea than you will from an ammonium nitrate product. Where the big difference comes in is actually the upstream production emissions, and actually no two products are necessarily the same as well. It depends on the production process. So two ammonium nitrate products from different manufacturers may have a different manufacturing process. Some may be from a renewable energy source, which will have a lower emissions intensity than some that have had produced from a coal-fired power station source of energy. So you do get quite a large variability within nitrogen emissions from the production of nitrogen as well as from the application emissions as well. So it's probably best to ask whoever you're buying it from whether they've done an analysis of the emissions assessment. And actually what we're finding is most of them have these days, and they will know what the emissions associated with the production of their nitrogen products are.
Yeah, I suppose I just wondered, but most of the nitrogen, I guess, comes from gas. And is it intrinsically more efficient in terms of greenhouse gas emissions to manufacture ammonium nitrate or urea? I mean, the fact that the feedstock is the main cost in fertilizer, which is gas worldwide, and urea is the cheapest source. I wondered whether you just intrinsically use it's just a bit more efficient to produce urea, which is why it's cheaper, and that may well translate into using less gas and using less greenhouse.
Yeah, I don't have the figures off the top of my head, and as I say, it would be best to ask the manufacturer as to what the emissions impact upstream. It's not quite as straightforward as just saying using less gas. There are a number of different manufacturing processes, and some have abated nitrogen products, which have effectively got additional technology, and how much nitrous oxide is emitted from the manufacturing process, as well as the energy intensiveness of the production system as well. So there's a big variability in the different products that are used depending on the manufacturing process and the energy source used in manufacturing as well. So sorry, it's a bit of a vague answer, but it's best to ask the specifics of the people you're buying it from, basically.
Just to back that up, there's a couple of guys from Yara here. If you go and speak to those guys, they might be able to link you up with Mark Tucker. He has some excellent data around the different production methods and different amounts of CO2 from production. And as Hugh says, as a farmer, you've got two liabilities. One is your choice of it, where you buy it from, and the liability you import to the farm when you purchase that. The second is then how you use it and your own liability of use. So there's two different components to it.
Okay. Oh, we've got a question at the front. Alistair.
This one for you, Clive. Ignoring the loss of sleep and worry over your approach, how much extra time does it take to go into that level of detail compared to just accepting the expected yield equation and applying to that?
Yeah, that's one of the challenges that the system does have, is that there is an investment you've got to put into your time to go and collect that data. And what I've noted this year is that while people's enthusiasm at the start of the project was quite high, it did wane as the season went on. But unfortunately, it's at the end when you're trying to make those decisions, and the best decisions, when the plant's utilising as much as it can from the soil, when it's most important. So I've got a bit of work to do in motivation to motivate one or two to get the finger out their arse a bit quicker and get round and get the data. But it is a challenge and it is an investment. But you don't get anything without working for it. We've got lots of little work in the background we're doing. We're looking at different ways of scenting that. We're looking at different technologies on how we can capture that data more accurately. And as Hugh's alluded to, trying to understand that in levels of variability across a field as well. It's very important that the most important decision to get right is the best average rate for the field. If we can get that right, then we'll have biggest impact. We can then manipulate that with the technologies that are available and take that to another level. So there's a lot of work still to do. We're still in very early days with that.
Okay, thank you. I could see Henry nodding throughout there, so clearly there's a farmer over there who needs motivating.
I'm not pointing fingers.
Okay, have we got any more questions from anybody? No? Oh, yes?
Have you done any work with foliar applied nitrogen?
So one of the growers this year has used quite a number of different products. He does apply certainly some ammonia type products or amino type products. That this year has been a real eye-opener in terms of the biological response. The cold weather has crippled that and it hasn't really taken the nitrogen up at all. And so there's been a huge learning that we've all had from that this year. I don't know, I'm going to put Henry on the spot now, I suppose, but just the understanding and the measurement of that data and trying to understand it is something that's different. It's a different way of looking at it. And I think most of the growers, and I'm looking at Henry now, have found that quite insightful, but equally, while they've been questioning what we've been doing. So I don't know, would you agree with that, Henry?
No, we've not got any evidence.
Yeah. But it's just more information to manage around. And, it's no different to what we do with irrigation. It's the same principle. We look at a soil moisture deficit, apply water when it's needed. We're trying to look at the same with the nitrogen and when that's mineralised. And the challenge we've got is I think we have little insight onto that mineralisation process when it occurs and how much you're actually going to get out of it.
Okay, thank you. Any final questions to round up? No, it seems everybody's happy. Well, I'd just like to thank Clive and Hugh for some really interesting presentations. Thank you. And thank you everybody else for coming and getting involved. Thank you.